In this video, we're going to recap what we've done in the last section. So for people who have gone through the last section and gone through the configuration of WebPack, the configuration of Gulp, and all of that, this video will most likely bore you and won't contain anything new. I just want to run through the tasks that we've set up and some of the general terminologies and what the individual files do for people who don't want to go through this section. So for people who don't want to go through this section, you will be able to find a starter pack that includes all these files I have here selected in File Explorer, everything but the Git repository. But for the Git repository, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you use a local Git repository or not. I recommend that you do, though, when following through a course like this. It's always very handy to be able to commit after every single video that you go through, so you can go back and see, what changed or how things might have gotten broken, so you can fix it and revert it if need be. So you'll receive this folder and all these files. I have this folder open in a console window and in a Visual Studio Code instance. And what you're absolutely going to need to do is you're going to need to pull down all of the packages that we are going to depend on. So inside of the package.json file, we have a handful of all of these packages that we are going to be needing for our build steps. So to grab those, just open up a terminal window, type in npm install. And that'll go out and that will download the proper versions of all of these packages. All right, so as far as the folder structure goes, we'll talk about all the files down here at the bottom last. As far as the folder structure goes, we have the VS Code folder, just contains VS Code, launch configurations, and settings. We have the build folder, which contains the build artifacts for our server build. We'll talk about how that happens here momentarily. We have an empty data folder that contains a folder called sets, and that's where our card sets are going to go. So it'll just be data read off the server. We have the public folder. The public folder is going to be served publicly, not surprisingly, by our web server. So any file that you put into the public folder will be publicly accessible from the Express web server that's been set up. We have our views folder, which contains our index.pug, which is all the actual HTML that's going to be served out. I mean, it's not in HTML, it's in pug, which is the new name for Jade, the templating engine. But we are going to be controlling pretty much the entirety of the application through React. So all this file does is it includes files that that Webpack is going to build and bundle for us. It also includes a div with the ID of mount as well. The source folder contains the source code for our client and server, not surprisingly. Inside of client, we have a handful of files. We've already written a component, or stubbed out a component already, called app.js. And app.js just contains a really straightforward component that has a button in H1. We'll be clearing all this stuff out once we start building up the application. This is just for testing to make sure that React is working properly. It also has a corresponding SCSS file for styles. We have the client.js file, which the client.js file is the entry point into our application. And the way I wrote it is it's going to support hot module replacement. And we'll take a look at what hot module replacement looks like here in a moment. And it also goes out, it grabs routes from the routes module, which you can see right here. And the routes module simply returns the app container, because the app container for right now constitutes the entirety of our React application. We're going to be adding some more into this function for things like routing and all the other components that we might want to need. They will be added into routes.js. Client.js just includes those routes into it and then renders it out. If you are curious about how the hot module replacement is working, if you don't understand this code, definitely go back and look at the Webpack HMR1 video and the Webpack HMR2 video, and it'll explain that code for you. We also have a client SCSS, which is included from client.js, and these are just the styles that are going to be global to our entire application. And it also includes Font Awesome, so we'll be able to use Font Awesome for our icons. Now in our server, we have server.js and settings.js. Settings.js just exports one Boolean called isDevelopment, which will be true if we're in development mode, false if we're in production mode. Server.js, and it'll decide that based off of the node end environment variable. Server.js, really straightforward. It's a basic Express app. We include Express HTTP. We include the isDevelopment flag. We set up Express. We configure Express to use the Pug view engine and to serve out the public directory. And then we have one rule on Express that says, Express says, if you request anything that isn't a physical file in the public folder, it's just going to serve out this index.pug to us. And then the index.pug is going to include our styles and our scripts. And then we just start it up on port 3000 or whatever the port environment variable might be. And that's our server. So then we have a handful of dot files in our root of our application. We have Babel RC, which configures Babel. It also configures module React hot loading for components, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But this just, for our Babel RC just configures all the transpilation that's going to happen, where we're able to use newer features of JavaScript that aren't yet standardized and aren't yet available in browsers. By having our Babel RC, by having Babel configured with the Babel RC, we'll be able to use those features, including class properties and the object rest spread. Which we'll have a video about the object rest spread at some point. Then we have a git ignore, which just ignores node modules. It ignores the build folder, and it ignores the public build folder, which doesn't exist yet. Then we have our ESLint RC. This file just describes the rules that ESLint's going to use. ESLint is a linter. It will validate our code. With all these rules set up, it will show errors when I do something that I shouldn't, like reference a variable that doesn't exist, for example. And ESLint is going to be, we're going to be using ESLint to ensure that our code quality is enforced throughout the entirety of our application. Then we have gulpfile.babel.js. I'll talk about all of these tasks here momentarily. We have jsconfig.json. All this does is tell Visual Studio Code that all of our JavaScript source code is located under the source folder. We have package.json, because this is a node project. We have a package.json with all our dependencies and other metadata. We have server.js, and server.js, and all that does is it adds source map support to Node.js itself, and then it runs our server build. So when we build our server into the build folder, we can just run server.js and it'll execute that for us. We have tests.js. Tests.js is similar to server.js, but instead of executing the server code, what it's going to do is it's going to search for all files underneath build that match, that are in a folder called __ tests anywhere in the hierarchy, and execute them as Jasmine test. We're using the Jasmine test runner. And then we have our Webpack config.js. And all this guy does is he exposes a Webpack configuration, and Webpack is the module loader that we're going to be using, and this just creates different configurations based off of whether or not we're in debug mode. So for example, if we're in debug mode, we enable hot module replacement and so on. If we're in production mode, we do things like extract the CSS out into its own file, and we optimize it, and so on. So the way that you're going to interact with this project mostly is going to be through the Gulp tasks. So these Gulp tasks are expressed in Gulp version 4. And so we can go ahead and, as long as we have Gulp installed globally, which we should, if you don't have Gulp installed globally, make sure you do npm install -g gulp-cli and hit enter. I already have done that. And I should be able to just do gulp -tasks. So the primary way that we're going to be, like I said, interacting with this is through all of these tasks. Build, client clean, client dev, dev, server build, server clean, server dev, server test dev, and server watch. So yeah, let's talk about these tasks. So build will perform, not surprisingly, a clean build. It'll clean out our build folder, and it'll also add build files to our public directory. And so we'll see an example of how to do a production build here in a moment. We have client build, which just builds the client. See, build will build both the client and the server. Client build will just build the client. Client clean will clean the client. I mean, they're pretty straightforward. Client dev, however, will actually run a Webpack development server and serve out our client builds through the Webpack development server and support hot module replacement. Dev well, let's skip dev for now. Server build just builds the server into the build folder. So it'll take all this code that's written in this server folder and it'll build it into this build folder using Babel so that we can use newer features of JavaScript. Server clean, pretty straightforward. Server dev will, not only will it build the server, but it'll watch the server, keep the server up to date. Every time we change a server file, it'll go ahead and update the build and do an incremental build. And it'll also, most importantly, it'll also actually run the server and restart the server every time a file changes. We'll see an example of that here in a second. We have server tests, which just builds the server, then performs all of our unit tests. Server test dev, which does the same thing, except it'll watch the test to make sure that every time a test changes, it'll rerun all the tests. And then server watch. And server watch will just keep the server up to date. Every time we make a change to a server source file, it'll keep the build up to date. Let's first talk about tests. I don't have any tests here yet, but I can create a bogus test here by creating inside of the server folder, creating a folder called __ tests in any folder underneath the server folder. And then I can create a new file called, I don't know, test.js, and I can write just normal test code. I can go ahead and say, using Jasmine, I can say describe something, then open up a closure here and say it works, and then say, I don't know, expect true to be true. Something like that. So now I have a test, and we can do a failing test too. It doesn't work, and we can say expect false to be true. And we can run these tests in two different ways. We can do our gulp server test task. So I can say gulp server test, and that'll build the server, and it'll run the tests. And we see that it indeed built the server, because in the build folder, we now have this new test folder with the compiled test.js file. And we see that the test did run. One test succeeded because of that green dot, and one test failed because of that F. But we can also do gulp server test dev. So server :test :dev, and hit enter. And what that'll do is that'll keep running our unit tests as we change them. So let's change this it doesn't work test to actually work. So we'll say expect true to be true, and I'll hit Control S. The second I hit Control S, it rebuilds the test and then reruns all of the tests in the file or in the entire project. So in this way, we don't have to spool up a server or anything like that. We can just do all of our unit testing, test all of the code in the server code in this manner. So that is running the server, or running the server tests. But we can also run the server itself and keep that up to date by doing server dev. So I can say gulp server :dev. Now it's important to understand that this won't start Babel, this won't start Webpack up, so it won't serve any any styles or scripts. It won't compile our client. So we won't be able to use it much except for just directly testing the server. And it's the same sort of deal. I can come in here to the server and maybe add some sort of console log hello world and hit Control S. And all I have to do is hit Control S, it recompiles and it relaunches the server for us. So it's a really fast way to do development. We could also do the client dev, but I'm not going to worry about the client dev because instead I'm going to just run the dev task, because the dev task will include the client dev and the server dev simultaneously. So if I simply do gulp dev, that is primarily the command you are going to be using when starting this project. Gulp dev will start everything. It'll compile the server, it'll keep the server up to date, and it'll rerun the server anytime the server changes, but most importantly, it'll run the Webpack development server. So if I go ahead and open up a Chrome window to localhost 3000, we see that our application is indeed running. What's going on here is we are hitting localhost 3000, which is hitting our Express server in our server.js file, which we have right here, because we're on port 3000. And it'll serve out that pug file. And so this is the result of executing this views index.pug. It turns into this. And then, to look at the build from Webpack, we have this build vendor.js and build app.js. And these are files that are being served out by the Webpack development server. These files contain all the source code that our server that constitutes the entirety of our client, including our dependencies such as React. Now let's take a look at hot module replacement. The simplest hot module replacement is going to be with styles. If I come in here to our client code and open up client.scss, let's go ahead and change the color of the H1 to blue. And now all I have to do is hit Control S, and you'll notice over here, in a second, it will hot reload all of the styles without me having to refresh the page at all. And so that's a fantastic way to test out styles and to do your styling, so you don't have to refresh every single time you want to change some sort of styles. Hot module replacement is also enabled for our React components. So any React component that we are going to write, we will be able to change the React component and hit Control S and have it recompiled and change on our website without having to do a refresh. So I can say hello world colon, I don't know, blah, 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 hit Control S, and because of our React hot reloading, we are able to see the change immediately. It's a really fantastic tool to speed up development time when you have maybe 5 Chrome windows open and they're all open to the game at the same time, and you make a change, you don't want to have to refresh every single one and then go back into a new game just to test a minor change. Of course, hot module replacement for JavaScript isn't going to work for everything. It's only going to work for React components, and in some instances, even a change to a React component might still force us to do a full refresh. But in most cases, making minor tweaks to the render method of our components will change immediately on our page. We can also see the output of that as we perform changes if we have our console window open. It'll tell us how long it took to rebuild the entire package. It'll also inform us of ESLint errors. For example, I have an ESLint rule that says I must have semicolons at the end of every line, even though in JavaScript you can not have semicolons if you don't want them. It'll not only notify me in Visual Studio Code, but if I hit Control S, it'll also notify me inside of the WebPack. Build. So yeah, that is the introduction to our setup, our build setup. We have client code that's compiled, server code that's compiled, tests that are compiled and ran. We have watch tasks. There's nothing stopping you. The Gulp dev task that we'll be using most often, there's nothing stopping you from having the Gulp dev task open as well as the server dev or the test dev task open as well simultaneously. The last thing is we also have debugging support in the Chrome developer tools as well as Visual Studio Code. If you have Visual Studio Code open, make sure that your Chrome window is that your Chrome install has the remote debugging enabled. You can look at that or find out how to do that in the debugging in Chrome video, which we'll talk about that. And you can go over into debug. I can say Chrome attach. I can just hit run, maybe go into the client code, into my components, put a breakpoint here, click the button, and now I'm in a debugger. As simple as that. And I can also do the same thing with the server. Come back into the debug panel, change to server attach. Now I can come over here maybe to my source server server.js and put a breakpoint right here for our app get. Hit F5 to attach to the process, refresh the page, and now I'm debugging the server code. And I can see all of the server code. I can inspect the res and rec variables as well, and so on and so on. So debugging is interactive debuggers are a fantastic way to track down bugs in your code as well as explore how other libraries interact. But that is our project. That is the basic setup that we need for properly compiling everything and the different development tools that we are going to be using throughout this series. You might run into issues with newer versions of packages. That's why I recommend you do not update the package.json file unless you know what you're doing and you're prepared to go and research documentation and change logs to figure out how to make the new updated package work with this project. All of these version numbers that you see here on the screen are at this moment and for the rest of this series pretty much set in stone. At the end of the day, all you have to remember is if I tell you to run the project, all you got to do is jump into a terminal window or command prompt, locate the project or navigate to the project, and type in gulp space dev. And then the project will start up and you'll be able to do development. And with that, we will see you guys in the next section.